There is a building in front of you right now. You have walked past buildings like it your entire life. You probably never stopped to ask why its first floor sits below the street, why the windows are half buried, why the entrance requires you to walk down to get in. You were told it was always like that. You were told the street was always that height. But what if the street wasn't? What if the ground itself, the very foundation of the cities we call ancient, arrived after the buildings? What if we are not the authors of this world, but its inheritors? Walking streets we did not raise, living inside walls we cannot fully explain. Told with remarkable confidence and very little proof that people exactly like us built all of it, from nothing. Here is the claim. It is simple and it will not leave you. Somebody buried the world. And then they told us we built it. Let me start with a pattern, not a theory. A pattern. In city after city, on continent after continent, there exists a persistent, almost stubborn anomaly in the historical record. Buildings whose ground floors sit below the current street level. Doorways that open into what is now called a basement. Windows that were clearly, architecturally, designed to let in sunlight, but which now stare into walls of compacted earth and fill of unknown origin. The official explanation for most of these is mundane. Gradual accumulation of debris, centuries of sediment, natural settling. Cities rise over time, we are told, the way river deltas do, slowly, incrementally, one layer at a time. And that explanation, taken in isolation, is not unreasonable. But the deeper I looked, the more that explanation began to crack. Because here is what gradual accumulation does not explain. The uniformity. The speed. The near simultaneous appearance of this phenomenon across cities that should have had no contact with one another, cities separated by oceans, by mountain ranges, by centuries of apparent cultural isolation, all showing the same pattern, all within the same rough historical window. That is not accumulation. That is an event. In Chicago, something extraordinary happened in the second half of the 19th century. The city was raised, physically lifted. The entire downtown grid, buildings, streets, infrastructure, was elevated by as much as 12 feet in some sections. It is documented. Engineers wrote about it. George Pullman, later famous for his train cars, was involved in the mechanics of lifting entire city blocks using synchronized jack screws operated by hundreds of laborers turning in unison. The official reason given was sanitation. The city's drainage problem was catastrophic. Sewage couldn't flow because the streets were too flat, too low. The solution, apparently obvious to the engineers of the 1850s, was simply to raise everything. Now, I want you to sit with that for a moment. The city was too low, the streets needed to come up, not the buildings torn down and rebuilt higher. Not a new city designed from scratch on elevated ground. No, the existing structures, some of them brick, were mechanically hoisted, new foundations inserted beneath them, and the surrounding grade raised to match. This raises a simple but critical question. Why were the buildings already below grade to begin with? If you build a city from nothing, if you are starting with open prairie and surveyed lots and organized urban planning, which Chicago most certainly claims to have been, you do not build your first floor 6 feet below the natural grade of the land and then wonder why sewage won't drain. You build at grade. You build above grade, if anything, unless the buildings were already there when the city was supposedly being built. Unless the raising of Chicago was not engineering innovation, but concealment. St. Petersburg is one of the most architecturally overwhelming cities on earth. Founded, officially, in 1703 by Peter the Great on a swampy delta at the mouth of the Neva River, it is said to have been constructed in approximately 20 years. Tens of thousands of labourers. A city designed in the Western European Baroque tradition, built on piles driven into marshland, populated almost entirely by architectural complexity that even today requires centuries of accumulated craft knowledge to replicate in 20 years on a swamp. Walk the streets today and count the buildings whose first floors are clearly, unmistakably subterranean. Not storage cellars, not deliberately sunk. Window surrounds with ornamental cornices designed to be seen at street level, now visible only from below grade or through iron grates in the sidewalks. Grand entrance arches that open 3 steps down instead of level or up. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. The deeper I went into the documentation, old survey maps, pre-revolutionary architectural journals, city census records, the more the silence was deafening. There are almost no records of construction, not the kind you would expect from one of history's most ambitious building projects. No contractor logs, no material procurement records at the scale the architecture demands, no workforce casualty records, though we are told the human cost was staggering. What there is the city, fully formed, inexplicably complex, already partially below grade at its founding. And here's the strangest part. When you ask why so many of St. Petersburg's ground floors are buried, the answer given is consistent and oddly uniform. Flooding. The Neva floods, the delta accumulates, the city sank. It sank into itself, into the piles it was supposedly driven onto, or was it already partially submerged when it was found? If this is new to you, consider sharing this with someone who asks the same questions you do. This kind of pattern recognition doesn't survive in silence. Let me introduce a word: mudflood. It is not a scientific term. You will not find it in geological literature under that name. What you will find, if you look, is evidence consistent with what the word describes: a rapid, large-scale inundation, not of clear water, but of liquefied sediment, mud. The kind of event that does not merely wet a landscape, but buries it, that deposits meters of silted material across hundreds or thousands of square kilometers in a period too short for the stratigraphy to reflect the gradual layering we associate with normal sedimentary processes. Does such a thing happen? Yes. We call them lahars when they follow volcanic eruptions. We call them debris flows when they follow earthquakes. We call them alluvial events when they follow glacial melts. We have documented them in the geological record with considerable frequency, but those are local, regional at most. What the pattern in the architectural record seems to suggest, and I use suggest deliberately because I am not making a claim, I am following a pattern, is something of a different order, something hemispheric, possibly worldwide. Consider the timeline as it appears in city after city. Between approximately 1750 and 1850, there is a peculiar clustering of events. Cities described as newly founded, cities described as rebuilt after catastrophic fires, cities described as rapidly expanding during periods of what is called the Industrial Revolution, and threaded through all of it, persistently, if you look, a buried layer, a first floor that should not be underground, not in one city, not in two, but in Paris, in London, in Vienna, in Moscow, in Cairo, in Delhi, in Istanbul, in Philadelphia, in Boston, in Cincinnati, the same anomaly, presenting itself with almost mechanical regularity. The evidence suggests something much larger was occurring than the official narrative accounts for. Let me widen the frame. Because this is not a European phenomenon, in what is now Pakistan, the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro reveal a city of staggering urban sophistication, grid-planned streets, standardized brick sizes, covered drainage systems, multi-story structures, dating to what mainstream archaeology places at 2500 BC. What mainstream archaeology does not dwell on is how many of those structures are partially or significantly submerged below the current ground surface. How many excavation shafts have revealed intact lower floors sealed by compacted silts that bear no evidence of long occupation before burial? The burial was not gradual. The stratigraphy does not support gradual. The burial was fast. In Egypt, the Great Sphinx famously shows evidence of water erosion on its body, vertical channels inconsistent with wind-blown sand erosion, more consistent with prolonged or intense water exposure. Geologist Robert Schoch documented this in the early 1990s and was largely dismissed by mainstream Egyptology. But the erosion is there. It does not care whether it is dismissed. In Turkey, at Göbekli Tepe, the site that genuinely broke the accepted timeline of human civilization when it was excavated in the 1990s, the structures were intentionally buried, deliberately covered with fill. Why? Nobody knows. The official answer is ritual. The evidence for the ritual explanation is largely circular, but the burial itself is not in question, and here's where it becomes impossible to ignore. In nearly every major civilization we call ancient, there exists a flood narrative, not a rain narrative, a total inundation narrative. Sumerian, Akkadian, Biblical, Hindu, Norse, Aztec, Hopi, Aboriginal Australian, Vedic, the story repeats, not with local detail consistent with regional flooding. With word spanning civilization ending scope, every culture telling the same story, every culture describing survivors, every culture describing a world that had to be rebuilt from almost nothing. Could those narratives, handed down, transcribed, possibly distorted over centuries, be describing a memory, a cultural imprint of something that actually happened? The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Now, I want to show you something specific, something that, once you see it, you can't unsee it. In the second half of the 19th century, roughly 1840 to 1900, there is an explosion of monumental architecture across the industrializing world. Government buildings of extraordinary complexity, universities, train stations, libraries, opera houses, hospitals, courts. The scale is staggering. The ornamentation, columns, reliefs, vaulted ceilings, decorative ironwork, carved stone facades is the kind that today would require decades of planning, years of construction, and workforces of specialists whose skills take generations to develop. These buildings are attributed to what we might loosely call the age of the horse and buggy. Pre-electrical, pre-crane, pre-power tool, workers with hand chisels and horse-drawn carts, architects drafting on paper with T-squares, communication by letter. And yet the construction timelines given in official records are routinely astonishing. Consider also the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. 200 buildings of monumental neoclassical scale, fully realized, ornately detailed, constructed in under 2 years, then almost entirely demolished immediately after. Why build it at all? Unless it wasn't fully built, unless it was found. The United States Capitol, a building of profound architectural complexity, was substantially rebuilt and expanded between 1793 and 1800, then again substantially between 1851 and 1868. The cast iron dome alone weighs nearly £9 million. It was assembled according to official records largely during the American Civil War, when the country's industrial and labour capacity was being catastrophically consumed by active military conflict. This raises a simple but critical question. How, not rhetorically, genuinely? How do you quarry, transport, machine and assemble £9 million of cast iron with pre-industrial tools using a workforce split across a war in the timeline given? The official explanation is great effort, American will, engineering ingenuity. And perhaps that is true. Or perhaps the official explanation collapses here. Perhaps what was being done was not construction from scratch, but finishing. Adaptation, claiming and completing what was already partially standing, or already completely standing, and adjusting the narrative to explain its existence. Look at the early photographs. I mean, really look. The cities in the photographs of the 1850s and 1860s, cities supposedly only decades old, supposedly built from frontier conditions within living memory, already possess the architectural vocabulary of ancient capitals. The scale is wrong for the population sizes documented. The ornamentation is wrong for the claimed workforce. The uniformity of the civic aesthetic across cities that had, at most, intermittent communication with one another is wrong for independent development. Boston, Philadelphia, Cincinnati, Chicago, St. Louis, separated by days of travel in the mid-19th century, populated largely by recent immigrants with no shared architectural tradition, and yet they built, simultaneously, in the same ornate neoclassical vocabulary, at the same monumental scale, with the same technical precision. Not similar, not influenced by, identical in approach, in vocabulary, in technical standard. The coordination problem is staggering when you look at it directly. The deeper I went into the dates, the more the official narrative struggled to hold its weight. Was there a shared tradition, an inherited template, a pre-existing infrastructure that the arriving populations found, documented as newly constructed and populated as their own? I'm not claiming that. I am asking, what else explains the coordination? Here is what the record shows when you look at mid to late 19th century urban history with fresh eyes. Between approximately 1850 and 1910, an extraordinary number of major cities experienced catastrophic fires, not ordinary urban fires, conflagrations. Chicago 1871, Boston 1872, Seattle 1889, Jacksonville 1901, San Francisco 1906, Baltimore 1904, London had its Great Fire in 1666, Moscow burned in 1812, Constantinople burned repeatedly throughout the 19th century, city after city after city, and in every case what follows is reconstruction. Rapid reconstruction, in most cases within a decade, reconstruction that somehow results in grander, more architecturally sophisticated cities than existed before, as if the fire was not a setback but an opportunity, as if the builders were not mourning what was lost but improving upon what remained or covering what was buried. In San Francisco, the 1906 earthquake and fire destroyed the surface city almost completely. What emerged in the decade after was a thoroughly modern, expanded, rationalized urban grid. And underneath that grid, underneath the new foundations poured after 1906, there are, in places, architectural remnants inconsistent with the city's official founding date of 1849. Brick vaults, tiled floors, iron frameworks, structures that predate the gold rush, predate the settlement, predate, apparently, the city that was supposedly built there. Not all such remnants are well documented. Many are mentioned in passing in contractor reports, then never followed up. Some appear in local newspaper notices from the Reconstruction era, described with mild curiosity and then forgotten. The silence was deafening. Not active suppression necessarily, perhaps something more diffuse and more disturbing, a collective cultural decision not to ask the question, a shared agreement, conscious or not, to accept the given story and not pull at its threads. Because here is the terrible implication of pulling at those threads. If the buildings were already there, if the cities were inherited rather than built, then the question becomes not how they were constructed, but who constructed them, and when, and what happened to those who built them. And if you've been watching this channel, you already know the name that keeps surfacing at the center of that question: Tartaria. Not a confirmed empire, not a verified dynasty, but something, a presence on maps that later disappeared, a geographic designation that was quietly retired, a civilization-sized blank space in the official record. The architecture we've been discussing, the ornate, the monumental, the technically inexplicable, may be its fingerprint. Buildings too sophisticated for the timeline we're given, maps that showed it then didn't, a cartographic erasure so thorough it looks less like revision and more like deletion. If Tartaria was real, if it was advanced, connected on a worldwide scale, and deliberately removed from the record, then the mudflood was not just a natural catastrophe. It was the mechanism of its disappearance, and that is where the mudflood, or whatever we choose to call the event, re-enters the picture. Not as a curiosity, not as a geological footnote, but as a mechanism, a reset, the event by which an entire civilization was not merely destroyed, but overwritten. If something buried these cities, if a genuine mud flood event of regional or worldwide scale deposited meters of silted material over functioning urban infrastructure within a human lifetime, then the cause matters enormously, because the cause determines whether this was natural catastrophe or something else entirely. The natural case is not without support. We know that the early 19th century was a period of significant climatic instability. The 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia was the largest volcanic eruption in recorded history, triggering what is called the year without a summer in 1816, crop failures across the northern hemisphere, famine and climatic disruption that persisted for years. We know that the last glacial retreat, largely complete by 10,000 BC, left behind conditions in which large-scale alluvial and lahar events were not merely possible but predictable. We know that the Caspian Sea, the Black Sea, the Mediterranean basin have all experienced rapid water level changes in the geologically recent past, changes that would have been catastrophic for any civilizations living at their margins. But here's the problem with the purely natural explanation. Natural catastrophes, even large ones, do not tend to produce uniform burial. They do not tend to produce the same depth of fill across cities separated by thousands of miles. They do not tend to produce the same evidence, the same half-buried windows, the same subterranean first floors, the same inexplicable transition in the architectural record on multiple continents at roughly the same time. Unless the natural catastrophe was of a scale we do not have a contemporary framework for. A pole shift, a cometary impact in an ocean basin, a rapid glacial melt of the kind that geologists quietly refer to as meltwater pulses, events well documented in the paleo record, the most dramatic of which, meltwater pulse 1A, raised the world's sea levels by approximately 20 meters in a period some estimates suggest was less than 500 years, possibly less than a century, possibly less than that. What would 20 meters of sea level rise in 50 years look like to a coastal civilization? To an inland civilization connected to coastal rivers that suddenly became inland seas? It would look like a mud flood. It would look like a wall of silted water arriving with so little warning that buildings were not evacuated but simply consumed, contents intact, first floors sealed, infrastructure preserved but buried. The evidence suggests something much larger than any single regional event, and here is where the question bifurcates in a direction I cannot ignore, because there is another possibility, not natural, not random, an intentional reset, not accidental destruction, not collateral damage, but deliberate erasure. If a civilization existed, technologically capable, architecturally sophisticated, connected on a worldwide level, and if that civilization was somehow dismantled, its populations dispersed or destroyed, its records systematically eliminated, its infrastructure buried or repurposed, then the mud flood may not have been the cause of the reset. It may have been the cover. A natural event, real in its devastation, used as an opportunity, a catastrophe that cleared the surface, buried the evidence of what came before, and allowed a new narrative to be written on top of it. New founding myths, new founding dates, new histories that began conveniently after the flood. The official explanation collapses here, because you cannot have it both ways. You cannot claim these cities were built by horse and buggy labour in 20-year windows and explain why their architecture presupposes centuries of accumulated craft. You cannot claim gradual urban accumulation and explain why the burial is uniform and rapid. You cannot claim there was nothing before and explain what is underneath. Something came before. Something was erased. The question is only whether the erasure was geology or policy. What is most striking, when you audit the documentary record of the 19th century, is not what is present. It is what is absent. Construction records, as I mentioned, missing at the scale the architecture demands. But there is more. Census records from major cities in the early 1800s that do not match the population implied by the existing infrastructure. Urban planning documents that begin after the cities were supposedly built as if the planners arrived to find something already there and simply drew maps of it. Municipal records in multiple American and European cities that reference, in passing, the presence of subterranean structures during new construction, structures not mentioned in any founding documentation. The deeper I went, the more this absence became its own kind of presence. Because absence, at sufficient scale and with sufficient uniformity, is not an accident. It is a condition. Information does not simply vanish. Not at this scale, not uniformly, not across countries that were at the time competing powers with every incentive to preserve their own distinct historical records, unless something else was happening. A process distributed and persistent of editorial revision, of institutional forgetting. Not necessarily a single actor, not necessarily a conspiracy in the classical sense, but a shared cultural project, perhaps unconscious, of simplifying the past into a story that could be controlled, that could be taught, that could be used. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The raised cities, the buried windows, the orphaned first floors, the architecture that shouldn't exist, the photographs of empty, monumental streetscapes populated by almost nobody, the fires that erased and rebuilt, the records that weren't kept, the questions that weren't asked. This is not fringe material. This is the photographic record. This is the architectural survey. This is the geological stratigraphy. These are things you can visit, measure, and photograph yourself. I want to leave you with a question, not an answer. If there was a civilization before ours, not mythical, not fantastic, but simply prior, simply more advanced, simply erased, what did it know that we don't? What was in those libraries we didn't burn because we didn't know they existed? What was in those first floors sealed in mud that we poured concrete over during the rebuilding? What does it mean to inherit a world and not know it? What does it mean to live in buildings you didn't build, walk streets that were raised to hide what's beneath them, inhabit cities whose architecture you can copy but cannot fully explain, and be told with great confidence and very little documentation that your ancestors built all of it in 20 years with horse carts and hand tools? The losses here are not merely architectural. They are not merely historical. They are epistemic. We may have lost entire categories of knowledge, ways of thinking about the physical world, ways of working with materials, ways of organizing civilization at scale that were not recorded, not transmitted, not inherited, because the people who held them were, in some event or sequence of events, simply gone. Not displaced, not absorbed, not gradually forgotten, but gone, rapidly, thoroughly, and in their place, us. Arriving at cities we called new, inheriting infrastructure we called ours, writing histories that began for all of them after the flood. The mud covered it, the fires erased it. The records were not kept, or were lost, or were revised into something manageable, something that fit the story that needed to be told, and the buildings remain. Patient, half-buried, their first floors dark and full of silt, their cornices sitting just at street level, designed to be seen from the outside, still waiting for a street that will never return to its original height. I don't know what happened. I don't know when, or at what scale, or whether the hands that covered it were natural or deliberate, but I know the ground is not where it should be, and I know we have never fully asked why.